Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center and our program on hemispheric drug policy. Is it time for reform? My name is Eric Olson, and I'm the Associate Director of the Latin America program, and we're delighted to see so many of you here today. I think other people will be joining us in a minute, so if you wouldn't mind kind of moving towards the middle, that would be enormously helpful. I also want to say a word of welcome to those of you joining us on the World Wide Web, and thank you for being part of this event as well. We're at an extraordinary moment in the hemisphere, in the hemispheric drug policy debate. For one, the nations of the hemisphere, including the United States, have been engaged in an unprecedented debate about possible drug reform scenarios led by the OAS, the Organization of American States, and motivated by sense amongst some nations that current policy is ineffective and even at times exacerbates problems of crime, violence, corruption, and social disintegration. This debate was front and center during the OAS's General Assembly meeting held earlier in June in Antigua, Guatemala, and was guided by an OAS report on the hemisphere's drug problems and possible scenarios for addressing the challenges of drug consumption, drug production, and trafficking. The United States was fully engaged in this process, as we'll hear from Ambassador Brownfield in a minute, and has at the same time been making the strong case that U.S. policy is not based on a war on drugs motif. A few weeks ago, we were privileged to have the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, Gil Kurlikowski, here at the Wilson Center for one of our national conversations on drug policy. And he said many times that the notion and the motif of war on drugs is over. The National Drug Control Strategy that was released at that time when he was here says quite clearly, the U.S. approach rejects the false choice between an enforcement-centric war on drugs and drug legalization. Science has shown that drug addiction is not a moral failing, but rather a disease of the brain that can be prevented and treated. The new strategy, the U.S. National Drug Control Strategy, looks ahead to our continuing efforts to reform, rebalance, renew our national drug control policy to address the public health and safety challenges of the 21st century. So you can see in that language and those positions and in the discussion at the General Assembly that there is a lively and interesting debate about drug policy in our hemisphere. We are here today to hear directly from two of the key players and actors in that debate. We'll begin with the Secretary General of the OAS, Jose Miguel Insulza, who will present the OAS report on hemispheric drug problems and the results from the General Assembly meeting earlier this month. The Secretary General, as many of you know, was originally elected to his current position in May 2005 and re-elected in March of 2010. He also enjoyed a very distinguished career as a public servant in his native Chile, where he served as Vice President, Minister of the Interior, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and many other positions. The Secretary General will be followed by Ambassador William Brownfield, Assistant Secretary of State for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement. Prior to this position, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Colombia, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and the Republic of Chile. We are delighted that they have joined us, and I would like to just turn it over then to the Secretary General for the presentation.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. I will be as brief as I can, even though, as I will begin by saying, in the Summit of the Americas of last year in Cartagena, Colombia, the heads of state and government that were assembled there of all the Americas gave us not one but two responsibilities. Actually, the famous report on the drug problem in the Americas is covering two mandates that were given at the same time. And to explain this, you would have to be present at the discussion, in which there certainly were some things that were common to all the presidents, to all the heads. First, that the drug problem was really still very, very much alive in the Americas, that even though in some countries violence had declined, in other countries violence had increased very much, and the use of drugs continued to be widespread, especially among young people, and that was a matter of concern. You always have to evaluate policies by the results they produce, and there didn't seem to be too many results, even though one must say that if you look at the results of the different issues, they are there, but actually the problem still continues to exist. So some of the presidents all the presidents were willing to undertake some kind of a study that would give them options and ideas about how to face the problem without disrupting the present drug policy. This is very important. I think that was a consensus. Nobody wanted to say, we are going to stop here and we're going to break with the past and do something different. No, with some degree of continuity, but there's some suggestions as how the policies could be modified or increased or improved if that was necessary. But they wanted, therefore, two different things. One was a very as scientific as possible study on all the issues dealing with the drug traffic. So it was a study in which, of course, some proposals, some ideas could be advanced on what the results of the study were, but the main thing was to have a very clear picture of the state of the drug problem in the Americas. While others were more inclined to the idea of looking into the future, like okay, let's find that, let's see what's going on, but how can this develop? What options exist for policies in a very clear and clear-cut way? So actually we had to draft two reports, and those are the two reports of the drug traffic problem in the Americas. One is the so-called analytical report, which serves the first purpose, and the second one is the so-called scenario report, which I will refer to in more detail later, but it's basically trying to cover all the options of development of the policies in the future, and as different kind of readings we will see during the discussion. Now, in the first report, we had basically to face one big challenge, was that the drug problem is a problem that's hemispheric. That's why it's of interest to the OAS. We try to deal mainly with issues that are hemispheric in nature, that happen all over the region. And certainly the drug traffic is something that encompasses the whole region, but in very different ways. I mean, if you go to each country in the region, each has its own drug problem, which is similar but not the same as in the next country. Some countries are more producing, some countries are more consumers. In some countries there's much more violence. In other countries there's not that much violence associated with the drug traffic. It's very difficult to make a description, even to group the countries in different categories would be a problem. So we decided to take a very different approach. First, we decided to ask for 6 basic studies to deal with the problem. One on drugs and development, drugs and public health, drugs and security, drugs and drug production, the economics of the drug trade, and legal and regulatory alternatives. And then we decided to charter the drug problem in all its different phases, because the special thing that the Americas have is that they have all the different phases present in the region in quite a relevant way. We cultivate drugs. I mean, natural drugs are produced in this region. And by the way, one of them, cocaine, is produced only in this region, only in 3 countries actually, which are Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia. Second, the production is certainly very relevant. Most of the drug is processed in the territory of the Americas. The trade is immensely important, and by the way, in the areas of trade is where you usually get most of the violence. And then the sale of drugs is also that's when when you sell the drugs, that's where the price rises. And then you have, frankly, the youth, who are the users of drugs and what can be done with them. So we try to follow this path, starting with the general consideration of drugs and health. We then which drugs are more damaging to health, how much people are affected by that, etc., etc. Well, then we go all the way from the consumption, from the production to the consumption moment as completely as we can in a study of this nature. We certainly could examine several problems, therefore, but I would just like to mention a few of them. I don't want to take too much of our time. Maybe we should have time for discussion. First, certainly drugs are of very different nature, and the production of drugs has evolved very much in the past few years. But it must be said, some general things can be said, and we have to. I will begin by that. First, the first drug of the drug of choice, the major illicit drug of choice, as you know, is marijuana. Marijuana is 80% of all the drug used by approximately 80% of all the drug users in the Americas. In spite of that, let me say that only 25% of marijuana is consumed in the Americas. I mean, so this is a drug that also in other continents has a large use. Cocaine, on the contrary, is a drug that is used by 50% of the use takes place in the region, and the same happens with heroin. But I would say that marijuana is still the largest, the one of largest use. Then there's a change. There's a major change in the distribution of that use. Actually, in the U.S., even though the U.S. continues to be the country in which more drugs are used, I should say that and even more cocaine is used. The consumption of cocaine has fallen very much, almost some say even by 50% in the case of cocaine. While in the other countries of the region, even though the drug use is still smaller than in the north of North America, there is a concern about the larger use of cocaine, larger use of pasta base. I don't know how you call it in pasta base, or crack, or all those kinds of derivatives of cocaine, which are really a threat today also to some of the countries in South America in a very strong way. And then I would say that another drug always appears, or two other drugs. First, it's alcohol. Many countries are classifying today the use of alcohol in categories of drug use. I don't know, you read a recent book, very, very important. I forget the name of the author. It's but a recent book on drug use by young people, which is very dramatic. But at some point, it has to mention that actually the drug that's causing more damage, more extensive damage, is a legal drug, which is alcohol, and the need to consider that drug in any kind of health policy is also very much relevant. The other, and by the way, some countries, such as mine, for example, in Chile, the service that deals with the matters of treatment and penalization and all of those drugs is also it also includes alcohol as one of the concerns. The other one is that there's an increased use of pharmaceutical and synthetic drugs, and that's also new. That did not happen, and I would say if this report had been drafted 20 years ago, that would not appear. Some say that this is real, that these are really the drugs of the future if the trade continues the way it is. Now, most countries at the same time tend to accept the idea of of some form of prevention, and necessarily, and of course, I would say not only the prevention and treatment, but also different kinds of ways of dealing with drug users. I would say that in general, there is even though there is not very much agreement on how to deal with the users, everybody tends to consider the users as people who have some kind of an illness, and rather than some that treat them as criminals. So I would say there's a very generalized concern in treating drug users as sick people and not as criminals. But at the same time, when you start talking about matters such as depenalization, decriminalization, etc., that becomes a harder issue. I should say, by the way, that I'm talking about this, that in general we did not find any support for any kind of decriminalizing drugs or legalizing drugs, except in the case of marijuana, in which the discussion is stronger in the countries. Though I must say that it's that the proposals to legalize marijuana are stronger in the United States than in other countries of the Americas today. Now, on the matter of however, another important conclusion is that one thing about the trade that must be said, or two things about the trade. First, three things about the trade. First, the roots of the drug traffic are very different for different regions of the Americas. The one that's more studied, of course, is because as I said before, is only produced in Latin America and in 3 countries, are the different routes of cocaine. The cocaine that is produced in Peru and Bolivia is basically trafficked to South America, to Europe, or beyond. Most of the cocaine that comes to the United States is original from Colombia. Original in the sense that is the only way in which the only of the 3 countries in which cocaine is grown. Actually, in Peru and Bolivia, it grows naturally. It's a local part of the local plants. But anyway, the routes of Bolivia and Peru are southern routes, go to the southern cone, from there a little bit upper north in Brazil, and then they go to Europe and the African markets. And even though we don't have a clear data on how much stays in the region and how much goes abroad. The second thing that must be said is that the violence, the violence associated to drug traffic is usually much stronger in the countries of trade than in the countries of origin on the countries of major use. I'm not saying, of course, you know it better than I do, that there is no violence associated with drugs in the U.S. or in Canada. There is, of course. And of course there is also some violence associated to the production of the basic pasta, the pasta base, in Colombia, in Bolivia or in Peru. But the real violence is in the traffic countries, and that is what's creating the big alarm, precisely what has created the big alarm originally in Colombia, and then, or more recently, in Mexico, in Central America, and in parts of the Caribbean. Those countries are not, I would say, not very countries that use drugs very much. Actually, 3% of the drugs used in the Americas are used in Central America. But they are countries in which the violence has reached epidemic proportions, and that's one of the contradictions that exist. The countries of use and the countries of production are not the most violent countries in terms of drugs. The most violent countries are where the big wars, the big drug wars take place in the countries in which the roots of the drug trafficking go from north to south to north. And the third one is another special thing that really explains way better what I said at the beginning, that the problem is different in different regions or in different countries, is that most of the money is generated in the final steps of the drug process. Let me. If you read the report, you have the specific data there. But I think I can say it by heart in general. You usually pay a very low amount of money for a bunch of coca leaves. Now but in the first step after the cropping of the coca, once you turn it into a pasta, into a basic product to be transported, the cost in the prices in some of the at the border of some of the jungles in South America will be from $580 to $760 more or less. Give or take a few. Now, when that reaches the port, it would cost about $2,000 or $2,500, and when it's already sent to another destiny, it could be as far as $7,000 already for one ton of excuse me, for 1 kilo of pasta base. Crossing the border into the United States, or before crossing the border of the United States, that will have raised very much in cost. It would have gone as far as $10,000 to $12,000 or more. And in the streets of, excuse me, about $30,000. Excuse me, $30,000. And in the streets of a major city in the north, 1 kilo of that will go for about $133,000. So from out of the jungles into the users, the cost will have raised by about 500 times. Let me just say one thing. Everybody makes money from the drug trade. I mean, this is not saying that this is not a history of exploitation. Everybody makes money. I mean, the people that crop that plant or crop the coca leaves make money, and the ones that trade it make more money, and the ones that the people that do the dirty work, the killing, and all, they make money too. And finally, the micro seller, the ones that peddle it in the streets of some major cities, everybody gains, because this is something that really produces a lot of money. But the large part of the gain, 66% of the trade, is in the final step. And the final step takes about 66%. And paradoxically, that's not where most of the violence takes place. Most of the violence takes place in the other steps. That's a very an interesting conclusion. And we wondered why. And the reason basically is something that gives reason to some of the appeals to caution in this matter of drugs, which is that basically it's because of institutions. I mean, the rule of law has a lot to do with this. Many of the places where the drug wars take place are places in which the rule of law is not as strong as it should be. And on the contrary, many of the places in which most of the use takes place are places in which you usually, if you commit a crime, you usually pay for it. As somebody has said, probably you won't pay with such high a penalty. But it's very important to say that there's a clear relationship between the use, I mean, the degree of violence and the lack of the rule of law in some of the places in which the drug is trafficked. So we finally concluded our conclusions, our basic conclusion in these matters were essentially two. One is that that unless you reduce demand, the drug trade is never going to stop. Let me give you just one figure. I mean, in 2010, 1/2 of the cocaine that was produced was impounded, was confiscated. So the war, the so-called war, did reach an effect. I mean, half of the goods were confiscated, but the drug traffic continued anyway, and people continue going to jail Actually, we have about 3.8 million people in jail in the Americas, of which more than half which is more than one third, about 1,600,000, are in jail for drug related offenses. So it's the time to create a more holistic approach and some kind of a different policy dealing with demand is there, and most of the countries agree today that things must be centered on demand. The issue is what to do. The issue is what you do. I mean, it's very clear that we're going to treat addicts as sick people, as people who suffer a chronic disease that have to be treated, but it's not very clear what to do with them. The sole mention in the report on the word of decriminalization created all kinds of interpretations. We are not saying, but in any case, that people that are drug addicts should never be interned. No, that's not what we were saying. On the contrary, we say very clearly that people that, in some cases, when they're a danger to society or a danger to themselves, these people should be treated in special places. What we are saying is that they should not be treated as criminals, and they should not go to the same jails and places in which people are usually locked up because of committing common crimes. But that created a big discussion. So it's very clear that we have a problem. We have a public health problem, but we have to be. We don't have very clear decisions on the countries on how to deal with that, and that was visible in the General Assembly of the OAS at the beginning of this month. The second conclusion is that the institutions still play a big role. I think that it's important to recognize that the problem of the rule of law in some of the countries has been very relevant in matters of the drug traffic. And therefore, we have to concentrate not only on the health issue, and not only on trying to find different alternatives for treatment of drug traffickers, of users or small traffickers, but we also have to find alternatives in terms of increasing the capacity of the institutions, the basic institutions to impose the rule of law in several of the areas in which we're dealing with. Now, that was I hate to finish here because that's the analytic report, but the basic what I wanted to say about the so-called scenario report is that when we asked a group of experts, a fairly large number of experts, and also in interviews and all that, but we've gathered a group of people for this, was to draft different scenarios of where the drug trade or the drug problem could go. They drafted basically 4 of them. And I must mention that we asked them to do things that were credible, that were relevant, and that were different, that were really different one from the other, because it didn't make much sense to have 4 pictures of the same thing. And they came up with 4 scenarios, which I should say, the key to understand them, and this is in the report, is that all these people tend to see the drug problem, these 4 groups, the drug problem as a problem of a different nature. And that's why they suggest different proposals. The first scenario is the so-called scenario of togetherness. Together means we have to work together to improve the way we deal with the problem, because this is a hemispheric problem, and therefore we are all involved in it, and each has to play its own role according to its capabilities. So the scenario, this is very important. It's not that it denies what's in the others, but it centers in the idea that we have to improve the quality of the rule of law in the region, and therefore make a big effort the basic problem here is that we're dealing with the problem of organized crime, with a big enemy who is who are the heads of the organized crime racket, and therefore we have to deal with them in a much more efficient way than we are doing now. This is important I would say that the second scenario It's not completely different, but it starts from a very different point of view. It's called pathways. And it suggests that the problem is not with the application of the strategy, it's not the improvement of the strategy, it's the strategy itself. I mean, our repressive approach to the drug traffic, they say, is what really creates the problems. And there's this phrase that has appeared in so many newspapers and all that, even with a big title, saying that in Mexico, in a certain year, there were 566 persons who died victims of drugs. And in the same time, there are 60,000 who died from the violence associated to drugs. So it's true that drugs damage your health, they say, but the big danger is not in there, is actually in the number of people who are killed by effect of this drug, of the drug war, which should be changed. This does not preclude the idea of having better institutions and better police and better courts and all that, but says the emphasis has necessary to be in reducing the source of the problem, which is the violence, and for that is you have to study forms of legalization, of decriminalization, of the alternative penalties, etc., etc. That's the idea. The third scenario, which is called resilience, is not necessarily incompatible with the rest. This is a group of people basically from we work with basically from non-governmental organizations, local governments, etc., who actually raise the problem that this is a societal problem more than a government problem, and therefore the emphasis should be put on the work with local governments, with NGOs, with community groups, etc., etc., and they reduce the traffic in form of a community problem that deals with it in a much better way. Not incompatible with the others, but certainly a different focus. And finally, there was a certain reluctance to deal with the fourth scenario, because some people said it was not valid because no policy produced it. But finally, the idea was that it can happen that nothing is done. I mean, what happens if we leave the problem to itself and it develops on its own? That's what it's called. It's called, let me remember how it's called disruption, or ruptura in Spanish. The name of disruption was in some cases this report was done by people who speak English and Spanish at the same time. So in this case, the title we put was ruptura, and that was translated to disruption. And the whole idea is that some countries are faced. The whole idea of the ruptura scenario is that some countries are faced with such a heavy burden on the matters of the drug traffic that if something is not done to reduce that burden, they might start going by themselves on their own, on their own, without really paying attention to what the consequences are. The image of this is which is true. This is not an invention. The image is some high official in a traffic country, in a traffic country, saying, "Look, why don't we just open the door on one side and let them pass and make sure that they leave as soon as possible, as fast as they can. Nobody touches them. The road is open. You can go your way, and just leave us alone." And that's a concern. That's a concern. I would say that the big difference is that the three first scenarios have proponents, have people who say this is the basic approach, but there are also the fourth one doesn't have any proponents and things that nobody wants them to happen, but they felt that it was important to put it there because it could happen. Now, I myself think that we have looked at these scenarios in 4 rows. Maybe we should, at some point, look at them across. Every alternative is there, and maybe in each of these these scenarios, there are some things that can be done and can be combined in a more creative way. But in general, I would say that this is a discussion that just started. We are just beginning to work on a strategy of what to do. From this report on, our General Assembly in Guatemala very recently called for some process of consultation and dialogue among the countries, among the regions, among different groups in society, and we're working very hard on promoting that. And we are already starting these kind of meetings everywhere and see if we can really reach some kind of a progress in this matter. The big thing is that, as we said, sometimes the ice has been broken, and the discussion is on, and nobody wants to go on its own. Nobody wants to go on its own. Everybody feels that it's necessary for change, but that change that has to be concerted among all the actors. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for the long.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And I would like to direct a question to you in a minute, but before I do that, I want to turn it over to Ambassador Brownfield to give us his insights.
Sure. I could just yield all of my time to the Secretary General, but instead, ladies and gentlemen, I will say what I've learned to say over the last 12 years, and that is to agree with everything that the Secretary General has said, because when you're the son of a West Texas farming family, you know you should always defer to Jose Miguel Insulza on almost any issue that requires the exercise of mental capacities. Secretary General, Dr. Olson, ambassadors, Wilsonians, ladies and gentlemen. May I give you a quick 5 minutes and then turn this conversation over to you? First, it is quite clear that the 7 billion inhabitants, human inhabitants of planet Earth, are now engaged in a serious review of what our planet's drug policy and drug strategy should be. When we started this latest iteration about a year and a half ago, my opening thought was, we do this every 10 years, nothing seems to happen. I don't believe that is the case this time. A lot has happened over the course of the last year. The Secretary General has just described the OAS drug study, which is one of the more detailed and provocative studies that I have read in quite some time, with some degree of balance in terms of representing multiple positions. The Secretary General didn't mention, but he and I 3 weeks ago or so were down in Antigua, Guatemala, where the annual General Assembly of the OAS was dedicated to a review of drug strategy and drug policy, and agreement was reached that the Permanent Council of the OAS would determine whether and probably to hold a special session of the OAS General Assembly in the course of 2014, or I hope 2015, to address just this specific issue. The United Nations has not been silent. In March of next year, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs will hold a special high-level meeting to address drug policy, and the UN has already agreed that they will have their own special session of the General Assembly in 2016 to address this issue. And finally, for those of you who have been asleep for the last 7.5 months and may have missed it, 2 states in the United States of America have recently voted to legalize, not decriminalize, but legalize the cultivation, production, sale, and consumption of marijuana. So, ladies and gentlemen, there is a serious review going on, and may I offer you one view from this table, and that is, review is good. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, never in the history of the human race has a plan or a strategy been so perfect that it could not be made better by some sort of review and some sort of modification. If I might quote the 44th President of the United States when he was asked about this in Cartagena, Colombia in April of last year, we welcome the debate. And I can assure you, if he welcomes the debate, I welcome the debate. I have read Article 2 of the United States Constitution. I am aware of who I work for. The question that I would now offer is, where do we start? And to get a conversation going, let me say we actually have a number of principles on which I think there is consensus throughout the world. And many of them have been touched upon by the Secretary General. Others, I think, can be reached just by the application of common sense. Principle number one, everyone seems to agree we are not fully satisfied with current drug policy. If we didn't have that lack of satisfaction, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. Now, people have different reasons for their dissatisfaction. Some think it's too tough, some think it's too hard, some think it's too easy, some think we should have more emphasis in one area, others in a different area, but everyone seems to agree we're not fully satisfied with what we have right now. Second, there seems to be consensus that this cannot just be a law enforcement problem. As the director of National Drug Control Policy, that the good Dr. Olson mentioned was here in this self-same room within the last month, has said a number of times, we cannot arrest our way out of this problem. There are other elements to it. Third principle, some of you may disagree with this, but that's why we're having this dialogue. I believe there is consensus with the following statement. While some people are willing to espouse and advocate legalization of marijuana, no one is espousing legalization of any other illicit product right now. I have not heard anyone whose views I would at least take seriously saying we should legalize cocaine, heroin, methamphetamines, synthetic drugs, or the diversion of pharmaceuticals. I have not heard that. I may before this afternoon is over, but I submit that is an area of consensus, at least as of this moment, the 27th of June, 2013. Fourth principle I submit is the world seems to agree transnational criminal organizations engaged in the trafficking of illicit drugs are bad. I have yet to find a human being who says cartels actually deliver high quality and positive impact for societies and communities. So I think while we can argue how we get there, we do agree criminal organizations that are engaged in this sort of activity are bad for society. Fifth principle, international cooperation is good. Our starting point is the matter of drugs has an impact that crosses frontiers and borders and has an impact on multiple countries. Therefore, some degree of communication and cooperation between and among those countries and governments is a good thing. And sixth and finally, by way of consensus, and I'm pretty confident on this one and comfortable as well, sovereign nations will determine what their own individual drug policy is. We have conventions, we have strategies, we have agreements, we have cooperation, but at the end of the day, country A is not going to dictate to country B what its drug policy will be. The United States of America has no right to dictate what the drug policy in a second country may be, any more than any other country has the right to dictate to the United States of America what our policy will be. We have our own constitutions, our systems, our democratic or non-democratic processes, and we have accepted the principle that within the sovereign territory of an individual nation, it is that nation, its people, and its governments that will determine what their drug policy is. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I've offered you a starting point. 6 principles where I believe there is consensus. I would suggest to you that gives us a lot of room, a lot of space for creativity, new ideas, and a good rowdy debate and discussion. Let me offer a couple of suggestions before I close in terms of where I would be comfortable taking this discussion. First, Eric has mentioned it already when he mentioned that the drug czar, he hates that name, by the way, so be sure to call him that when next you see it. He really hates it, so by all means, call Gil Kurlikowski the drug czar. read the latest national drug strategy. ONDCP spent a lot of time working on this strategy specifically to address the issue that we have gone beyond the war on drugs and focuses with a great deal of attention on the matter of public health as the issue, or at least a driving issue, that should be leading this effort in terms of addressing drug issues and drug policy. Second suggestion, a principle to keep in mind. Let us, as we look to the future and reviews and modifications, try to reinforce that which is working and at the same time fix that which is not working. I will offer a couple of U.S. perspectives. If it is true, and I believe it is, that over the last 6 years, consumption of cocaine and methamphetamines in the United States has dropped dramatically, like to the tune of 50%. Wouldn't it be nice if a new approach did not work counter to that trend line, but perhaps might address other trend lines, such as the increase in consumption of heroin, marijuana, synthetic drugs, diverted pharmaceuticals? That would be a nifty thing. Reinforce what seems to be working, fix what seems to be broken. Third suggestion, what I call balancing the continuum. The continuum is the lessons that we have learned over the last 40 years on dealing with the drug problem. It's like a chain of many links. It starts with cultivation, goes through production, and then transportation, distribution, sale. It includes money laundering and financing, precursor chemicals. Each one of those kind of defines a link. And Brownfield's postulate is we've got to deal with the entire chain. We can fiddle with individual links, put more emphasis on one link, less on another, add an additional link if you wish, but let's keep in mind that at the end of the day, we have to deal with all elements of this in some way, whether it is through education, medical treatment and rehabilitation, law enforcement, social engagement, whatever the approach may be. Let us keep in mind that if we ignore some link in this chain, those who wish to do mischief will take advantage of that whole. Fourth suggestion that I make for purposes of this conversation, while I am completely open, honestly, to the argument that we do not want to make drug policy a law enforcement, police, arrest, and detention policy, we do have to have some focus on those organizations who are engaged consciously and intentionally in criminal activity. We have to address in some way those organizations. We can do it more or less, harder or softer, pig-headedly, stupidly, or with amazing nuance and sophistication. But we have to incorporate that somehow into our policy and approach. Suggestion number 5, science and evidence. No one is more excited and enthusiastic than I am at allowing hope to drive our thinking and aspirations for what will happen in the future. Please do not ask me to endorse a strategy or a policy that is based upon nothing more than a hope, not supported by any evident science or evidence, empirical evidence that this will produce change. In other words, we've got to do the hard work. As the Secretary General was just suggesting, much of the analytical work, much of the statistical work, which can drive us and help us to understand better what we can or should change and what the impact of that change is likely to be. Sixth suggestion, many of you will hate this. We have 3 international conventions that are accepted by the overwhelming majority of the governments and countries of the world. I think it's 165 or so, who have in fact ratified the 3 conventions. Ladies and gentlemen, the conventions actually have a great deal of flexibility written into them. There's a lot of stuff you can do within those conventions without having to change the conventions. I would hope we could reach a decision someday that we can do a lot of modification and adjustment without having to change fundamentally the conventions. Why? Because it took us 40 years to get these conventions approved by as many countries as we have, and 40 years is a long time to wait to get another set of conventions through. And second, if you will permit me just a tiniest bit of concern from a purely U.S. perspective, is there anyone in this room that is prepared to say to me, naming yourself and speaking publicly, that you believe we could get a new convention or treaty through the United States Congress before I die of old age and natural causes? And ladies and gents, I feel pretty good. I'm feeling, my old man made it to age 95. I'm probably good for another 35 years, and I still do not believe we would see that happen. So Brownfield's suggestion to you is, let's look for solutions that allow us to operate within the existing international legal infrastructure. Suggestion number 7. I address this issue as trying to find a solution or solutions that fall between the 2 extremes. What are the extremes? I define them, this is a personal definition that does not necessarily reflect the views of the United States government. I define the 2 extremes on one end as the strict prohibitionists. It's all illegal. We're going to arrest them and put them in jail if they grow it, produce it, smoke it, sniff it, snort it, swallow it, or do anything with it whatsoever. That's the strict prohibitionist extreme at one end. At the other end, I would suggest, are the absolute legalizers who say if we would just legalize everything, the entire problem would go away. The criminal organizations would close down. No one would abuse the use of the stuff. We wouldn't have health problems, social problems, economic problems whatsoever. I suggest we try to find a solution somewhere in between those 2 extremes. That's a lot of space, ladies and gentlemen. That still gives us about 80% of the continuum that we can work through, but let's at least try to define the parameters and agree we don't want to go to the extreme left, we don't want to go to the extreme right. And that's kind of the wrong way to describe this, but nevertheless, to either of the 2 extremes, which to a certain extent is what the Secretary General's set of scenarios was trying to do, although it worked its way in to a certain extent from the extremes, but that was what some of the scenarios were suggesting. 8th and final suggestion from my perspective, and some of you will like this and some of you will not. Ladies and gents, it has taken planet Earth, and specifically this hemisphere, about 40 years to get into this drug situation or this drug mess. We should not look for instant solutions. I accept the argument that we have not fixed the problem, whatever that means, over the last 35 years. True enough. I do not accept the argument that if we did 1 or 2 different things, we would fix the problem in the course of the next month or year. It has taken us decades to get into this problem. We are going to need some degree of strategic patience in getting out of it. Flexibility, long-term thinking, and willingness to adjust as the reality changes around us. Ladies and gentlemen, let the debate begin. Let the debate be rowdy. Please keep in mind the good Dr. Insulza represents 34 governments, and I represent 1 government. We must eventually, before we can agree with a position in a debate, see how we can sell that to, in my case, a large majority of 315 million citizens of the United States of America, and in the case of the Secretary General, about 1 billion humans in the Western Hemisphere. Practical, moderate, somewhere in the center, in between the two extremes. That eventually is where I submit we will have to find a solution. Let the debate begin. Dr. Olson, I yield the balance
Thank
of my
you
time.
very much. I appreciate it. Let me just ask a couple of quick questions here. First to Secretary General and Sousa. I think the report and the scenarios is really quite an accomplishment. I must confess that at the beginning when I heard about it, I was a bit skeptical. I think I even said it to you in a meeting we had somewhere. But it really is a very fascinating, interesting, good, positive piece of work. And if you haven't read it yet, I encourage you to do it. But I think what a lot of people are wondering is this going anywhere? Is this headed in any particular direction? We've had debate. There was debate at the Summit of the Americas at Antigua. Now there's talking about the possibility of a new special session in 2014, or if Ambassador Brownfield has his way, 2015.
First quarter, though. First quarter.
Okay. So, and you also mentioned that there really isn't consensus on a number of fundamental things. So I guess I'm wondering, can you give us some sense that this will produce something? Will this change the hemispheric counter-drug strategy, the plan of action? Can we expect anything from this process?
Well, I would say that the first reaction is only natural. Usually people are very skeptical about the OAS, I admit that. But I would say that's why when the report appeared, everybody was very surprised. Then they took about 15 days in taking in that surprise. Then we had the General Assembly. And since the General Assembly did not proclaim the legalization of anything, they felt it was a failure or something like that. This is a process that we are going to do. And I completely agree. Well, I completely with almost everything that Bill said. But he also said, among the very intelligent thing he said that it took us 40 years to build a system. Let's not look for instant solutions. That's a fact. But there are some roads where we can begin traveling. First, we have to continue this debate. I mean, this debate is just open, and therefore, to form consensus, there must be a lot of factors going into the fray. I must say that we had 3 meetings of our group of scenarios, and the third one was much more consensual than the first one. That happens in the debate, especially because in everything there's different points of view. Just one example. I mean, for example, in the matter of marijuana legalization, of course, you have to take into consideration so many things. I mean, that when you put them on the table, you realize that everything is to some kind of solution. Does it damage your health? Yes, it does damage your health. Does it damage your health more than alcohol? No, it doesn't. Does it have the same effect or the same final effect on people who are college students who smoke marijuana, or in poor people in poor neighborhoods, who, as some president said, is very different when you make an option for drugs. You can overcome that option, than when you take drugs because you have no option. And that's certainly a fact in a continent in which we have so many poor people and so many people that don't go to school and don't work. That has to be considered. So there's too many options, and we have to continue this discussion and trying to find, as Bill said, the hard data that will allow us to make some real decisions. But in the meantime, I would suggest first that we should continue working on the public health approach. I agree with Bill that there's a sea change in the policy of that Mr. Director Kerlikowski announced a few days ago. I think that's very important, and it's very important to put it also in perspective into other countries, because in some other countries, I mean, let me tell you this. I mean, there are some countries in this region I will not talk about other regions of the world. In Mexico, in the country of Asia, there's three Mexican citizens who were about to put to death because they were in a ship that was carrying drugs. So, but in this continent, there are much stronger approaches to the drug problem than there are in the United States. So maybe, so when we talk about the public health approach, we are talking about something projected into the whole of the hemisphere, where the services for treatment of drugs are really very poor. So there's a lot of work to do there. There's also an agreement that we should increase our capacity or institutional capacities, institutional capabilities. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of, first of the public services, public health services, but also on the police services, in the court services, and in the jail services, because jails today, many people are in jail for drug possession, which means that many of them are users, and are thrown into jails from which they will not come nearly as any like the one that, they will when they finish their sentences, they will have probably changed their whole attitude towards life. So that's something we have to do. Institutional capacity is something we agree that we should begin doing. Then, of course, we have to discuss on the issues of, I spoke about that already, of alternatives to jails. And that also means investment. Several countries, in some countries first, drug users are sent to jail, which is, from my point of view, not a proper response to an addiction. And second, even if you wanted to send them to a clinic, there are no places in which to send them. So there are no really alternative systems. Alternative legals and health systems is something that we have to work already. And fourth, we have to deal with the money. I think that the work that we do in our countries is really still very poor in terms of money laundering and the uses of the drug money. Actually, this is a big business. This is several $billion, more than $100 billion a year is the drug trade, and therefore that provides for a lot of money to be laundered, and a more of money that's financing an expansion. If we want to fight the crime organizations, the criminal organizations, let us understand that they function as a business, and businesses usually, when they are doing well, open to other activities. They start with drugs, then they go into gun smuggling, then they go into human traffic, then they go into piracy, into intellectual piracy. Then they will find other things to do, and they are growing with the money of the drug trade, and we are not doing anything about that. Those are four things we agree on. We're going to start working on them while we agree on the others. We have tried to reach agreement on other more bold matters that will probably be more on the headlines. I think those four things are things that we're going to try to do in the next few years.
Great. Ambassador Brownfield, I take your point that there is at least some element of this that's law enforcement related, and it would be probably unwise to pursue a policy that did not involve any law enforcement, especially for the big criminal networks. But there's also a perception out there that what we end up doing, and I don't mean just the United States, the region as well, ends up by default focusing so much in that direction, law enforcement and security forces, and we essentially end up chasing drugs around the hemisphere. We focused in the Caribbean at some point. We focused in the Andes first, then the Caribbean route, then that moved to Mexico. Now it seems to be moving to Central America, and we sort of just keep chasing this problem around and never really, I don't want to say solve it, because I actually don't think you can solve it in a real sense, but that we just kind of don't have a good strategy, and we just kind of play whack-a-mole, frankly. What are you seeing that suggests that either that's not true, or we're considering some new, better approaches to this problem?
Yeah. I take your point. I take your taking of my point, and I think you make a valid point. Although I have to say, I will use my organization, the Bureau for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, which has 4 missions clearly articulated: counter narcotics, international crime writ large, which goes beyond just narcotics, obviously, law enforcement, which is support for law enforcement, and rule of law, which is, in essence, the entire rest of the universe out there that deals with justice and legal matters. Now, that's a pretty big brief. I'm perfectly comfortable putting resources and effort in areas beyond just drugs and drug law enforcement. Why are we putting so much in the law enforcement side of drugs? Actually, that's a question for all of us to ask. Why is it that the societies and the communities in 34 different countries in this hemisphere and another 100 or so elsewhere around the world, when asked or consulted via their elected or representative legislatures, seem to prefer to address it in this way? Partly, I guess, it is a failure on my part, and that of a few others, thank you very much, to articulate the other elements of this package in a more coherent way. I'll accept some of the blame for that, but I submit to you there must be a reason why people who are in many countries and in many communities at or below the basic subsistence level, when consulted, in essence, through the political process, do you wish to put your resources, your taxes, your money into building better employment, improving education, offering rehabilitation to those who have engaged in drug trafficking activities, or put more money into police, prosecution, incarceration? I'm actually somewhat surprised to find that when you listen to the people, you get a very hard response. That doesn't mean it's right, but it does mean we have to figure, if we have reached conclusions, and I think we have, that there is more to this. I'll say it again. We cannot arrest our way out of this drug problem. We have to find a better way to not just have an alternative, but to make that alternative logical and coherent to the people that we are trying to convince. Now, we have seen here in the United States of America at least 2 communities, defined as the states that I will not name, but whose capitals are Denver and Seattle, who have decided in one specific part of this package, they are convinced. Now, when I say they are convinced, I don't mean it's 100%. I do mean that a majority of those who voted are convinced that this is a route that they're going to pursue. 16 other states, which I won't even try to name, plus the District of Columbia, I've already named that one, have decided they will test and experiment with the medical use of marijuana, defined rather broadly. But again, we are exploring, but we do have to keep in mind the governments and the international organizations can basically go only as far as the communities and societies are prepared to permit. And I have to tell you, I guess I can understand it. I have dealt in certain, I won't be specific, but in certain Central American nations where we have been addressing the issue of how to deal with both gang violence as well as violence perpetrated by drug trafficking organizations, which are not necessarily the same thing. There are gangs who traffic in drugs, and there are drug trafficking organizations who are wrapped into gangs, but the one does not indicate the other. And I have been somewhat surprised at how little enthusiasm there is down at community level for the kind of softer side approach, which is to say, the truce, the education, the community centers, the job employment or development schemes that actually give these people an alternative to being in gangs or to trafficking drugs. And when you consult what you're hearing at the very lowest level, at street level, is they're not really wild about that. What they want to see is, why aren't the police driving these folks off? So I am guilty of failure to have clearly enough explained the alternatives so that 7 billion people on planet Earth are in complete agreement with a different approach. But we all have to ask ourselves the question, is there some reason other than my inherent stupidity why I have failed in that effort, or are we somehow not communicating correctly?
Okay, thank you. All right, we have time for some questions from the audience. We have a couple of roving mics. Please raise your hand. Please identify yourselves. And we'll start here, obviously, with Eric.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm Eric Sterling from the Criminal Justice Policy Foundation. In the 1980s, I helped write the federal drug laws, and then later in the 1980s, I helped start the Drug Policy Alliance, among other organizations. And I think that, I really enjoyed Ambassador Brownfield's comments. And I wanted to pick up your last one about the reason why you perceive the people wanting to focus on enforcement. Having worked for the House Crime Subcommittee for 9 years, I think that part of the reason is that we talk about people in very hateful ways and in very superficial ways. Secretary Insulza, for example, talks about we shouldn't put users in jail, but it's wrong for addiction, creating this equivalence that users are addicts. And even though his report says most users aren't addicts, our default vision is that they are addicts. And we all hate addiction. We hate the people we see panhandling on the street. We hate the fear of disease. We hate the image that our own children are likely to become addicts. So we are very, very fearful of what may happen to our children. Another reason, of course, is the growth of the law enforcement bureaucracies themselves, who are ardently testifying, in city councils and state legislatures in the United States in favor of the status quo, and very adamantly against the kinds of changes that you've observed have taken place around the country. So that there's a reason why the public is so concerned. I'll just conclude by simply noting that when you said that there's nobody seriously talking about legalizing heroin, Huffington Post today, former Congressman Barney Frank, former chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, is talking about legalizing heroin. He speaks, I think, for many Americans who recognize that legalizing marijuana deals with a very small part of this problem. Legalizing marijuana is the smallest part of the violence and the crime in the streets associated with the drug problem. And we have to focus on legalizing heroin and cocaine. My name is Eric Sterling, and I'm happy to say it to you, Ambassador Brownfield.
I withdraw my suggestion that no one that I have ever heard has suggested legalizing heroin and cocaine. I suppose in many ways it's a question of how we define the term legalizing, and if we mean it in its extreme meaning, which I suppose is to say anyone can use it at any place and at any time. Even there, I bet I would catch you, but you would say that's not what we've done in Colorado or Washington either.
That's not what I or Barney Frank
No, I'm with you. No, I'm with you.
Okay.
Point taken.
I would say that,
Yeah.
that as Bill said, there's a problem with the terms. Tobacco and alcohol are controlled substances. There are places where you can smoke, there are places where you can't smoke. Some ages you can drink, ages you can't drink. So the problem is that in those cases, the drinking is not penalized, except if you commit some crime. Well, actually, when people talk, for example, about marijuana, they speak about that kind of approach, not just say from one day to the other that everybody is going to use marijuana whenever he wants. And there is, I think, an argument. I'm not saying I'm in favor of that, but there is an argument in favor of treating marijuana as you treat alcohol and tobacco, and at the same time, those who argue this say that we should be stronger in treating tobacco and alcohol. So there's no real passport to do whatever you want. In the case of the other drugs, the big issue is that it's very clear that the damage that they produce is much heavier. And even though that to a certain extent, as you say, in one of the extremes, you can go to say, well, let everyone do whatever he wants with his life and all that. I think that there is there's an argument to be made for some obligation of society to take care of their own. So I think that the issue is, but the first thing I would do if I would talk about some kind of, I would say, I wouldn't use any word, legalization, criminalization, decriminalization, etc., is to treat every drug in its own quote-unquote merits and not make a general statement on the treatment of drugs. And I will say that I can't say what Bill said and just withdrew. I mean, because I was referring to our study. In everybody, nobody who participated in our study, and we had about 300 people finally participated in some way in it, was in favor of legalization of other drugs, except marijuana.
We have a question up here, Arjun.
Thank you. My name is Graciela Reyes. I am an independent scholar. And my question to the Secretary General is, you mentioned the rule of law and also some institutional problems. And what can you say about the relation between crime and the security and police forces? Very many times the drug dealers and producers infiltrate the police forces, mainly in the countries where there are weak institutions. What did you find in the comparative scenarios of your studio about that?
Well, it's a difficult question, I must admit, but we found, I mean, the problem can be approached in different ways because you have different cases. And I spoke the other day with a minister of a smaller country. I was very frank in saying, look, when we had low rates of crime, because we did have low rates of crime at some moment, he said, our police was very inefficient and was small, inefficient, and to some extent corrupt. But that did not hurt the whole of society, because crime was not a big issue. I mean, when the drug laws and the clans and everybody came and the police remained the same, now it's completely, the rule of law is completely broken. I mean, there were several countries in this, I would say, not countries, at least parts of countries, portions of countries in the Americas, usually away from the centers in Latin America, rural areas and all that, in which the old I don't know how to translate it without saying a dirty word. So it was something like you give everything to your friends, you go with everything against your enemies, and you apply rules and regulations to the rest, or something like that. That was the law of the land. I mean, the policemen gave a free passage to their friends. They treated their enemies in a very bad way, and they dealt more or less with the arrival of organized crime, with the arrival of the drug traffic and all that. That changed very much. So the police, it's not the police that was corrupted. Probably the problem was that the problem became much larger. In other cases, in bigger cities, there were some very important police forces that were corrupted and destroyed by the arrival of organized crime. So I think that I shouldn't mention some cities. Some cities in the north of South America, in which actually they had reasonably good police forces, and probably and the ones that have, I must admit that the ones that have resisted better is the countries in which there is a national police. There's some kind of a discipline, and there's a kind of in which you join the police as a life career. So there you have a career, you have a certain security, you belong to some military or not body of people to which you are associated. So the community activity has a lot. Those resist better. I would say resist better. There are some police that you could test according to this. For example, from my point of view, and this is just again as Bill said, just my opinion, Jose Miguel Insulza's opinion. I mean, the fact that in Nicaragua you have lower rates of crime than in other countries has a lot to do with community life and with the quality of the police. And maybe if you compare that police with other polices in the area, you find a lot of clues on the matter that you were asking about. But I say the initial points are very different according to each country.
I think we have time for two more questions, so I'll take one here. Right here, the young lady.
I'm just going to stand because I'm really short. My name is Rachel Ween, and I work for the Charles Group. Actually, Bobby Charles is former Assistant Secretary for INL. I'm sure you know that very well.
I still hear from him from
I'm
time
sure-
to time.
Exactly, which is why we're here today, because we just wanted to see you. Okay, so I just wanted to, oh, and before I begin, my intern here is from the Evergreen State, so I need to correct you. It's Olympia, it's the capital of Washington.
I come from Texas. I have great difficulty with any of the other 49 states.
He was very upset, so. Okay, so your point about focusing on science, evidentiary support, it's obviously necessary. You know, without any sort of measures, how can you come up with a solution? You need quantitative data, but, you know, we read the National Drug Control Strategy all the time at the Charles Group, and Director Kurlikowski is a very nice man, and with all due respect to him, you don't see a lot of quantitative measures. It's just more of a fluff, I guess, about this is what we need to do. We need to take a more localized approach, specifically in the last one. I know that was a big part. So what kind of measures do you see being taken? I mean, do you see studies into law enforcement capabilities? Do you see studies into drug use in general? I mean, what is it going to have to just be a combination of both? I know you said we can't arrest our way out of this, so it's not just going to be a focus on law enforcement capabilities, but specifically what kind of methodology would you take?
Yep. Look, my point, and you'll all be relieved to learn that I am not going to enter into a statistical or scientific analytical response right now. My point simply is, and in fact, I'll even, before I even go any further, I'll say most of those who are participating in the debate are in fact doing this, which is to say, as they make a proposal for a change, a modification, or an adjustment, they are offering some basis for it other than the hope that that will make things better. And it may be statistical in terms of estimates of quantities or numbers of arrests or detentions, amount of dollars that are involved, countries, routes, and so forth. It may be scientific to the extent that it is dealing with the process by which drugs are produced, manufactured, distributed in some way, shape, or form. My point simply is that if we are going to have discussions and debate on how to change things that have been either enshrined in law, rule, or regulation, or have been matters of policy or strategy for extended periods of time, those who are proposing those changes, I submit, have the obligation to say, here is the reason we want or believe the change would be better, and here is the science or the evidence behind our assertion. Most in this debate do that. Some, who I will never name, even under pain of death, I think do slide a little bit too far toward the aspirational as opposed to the analytical in how they espouse their position and what their position may be. And my own view is, let's have whatever sort of debate we wish, but when we are ready to talk about specifics, how to change the law, how to change the rules and the regulations, how to change the strategy and the policy, that at that stage we lay out the science and the evidence behind it. That's the only point that I'm making, and I would describe that, well, where I grew up, we would just call that common sense. And I suppose there's a more sophisticated way of saying it, but I did not mean to suggest any more than that.
Good. We're running out of time, so let me just take two questions together. There's one here and there's one back there in the middle again. Arjun, why don't you give it here, and then we'll allow the speakers to give a final response. And please try to keep it
Yes,
short. Here. We don't
thank you very much. My name is Horacio Basoverri. I used to be the ambassador of Bolivia in Vienna, so I agree with the secretary has said and yourself. Certainly, I assume that next steps that should be taken should take in consideration the multilateral scenario. That means the three treaties that we have in the issue of drugs, and also the sister treaties, that is the Palermo and Merida. And also, I would say that we should focus also in pursuing toward 2006. It is important that date, and we should do that in terms of there was a country that in 1998, also from our region, also took the step to our special session, that was Mexico. So I will believe, Secretary, that Latin America has the momentum with this initiative in Guatemala to approach as an example to other regions in the issue of whatever you want to call it, changing the policies, or approaching to a dialectic scenario where we treat drugs in the frame of our treaties. Thank you very much.
Okay. And then last question here. I think that's Coletta. I can't see very well in the lights.
Thank you. I'm Coletta Youngers with the Washington Office on Latin America and the International Drug Policy Consortium, and I will try to be brief. First, I'd just like to commend the OAS for this study. I think it provides a very important tool for debate in the region. And I, like Eric, I was skeptical, but I think that you have done a tremendous job in putting out a lot of issues on the table for discussion, and very much appreciate that. My question is for Ambassador Brownfield. I want to pick up on your last point, well, several points that you've made about the importance of a public health approach as expressed in the last National Drug Control Strategy report, that we can't arrest our way out of this issue, and the need to base policy on scientific evidence. And my question is, will the U.S. consider the decriminalization of consumers? If you're talking about those three elements, the obvious place to start is by not putting drug users in jail. And we now have the experience of Portugal, which more than 10 years ago decriminalized consumption. Drug use, problematic drug users get treatment instead, and various other kinds of assistance instead of going to jail. And we now have a variety of studies, both by the Portuguese government and academics, which show that this experience has been very positive in terms of no significant increase in drug use, in fact, a dramatic decrease or a decrease in heroin use, less incidence of HIV/AIDS and that sort of thing. Prison population is down, and the police say that they are now able to focus their efforts on criminal organizations. So my question is, would the U.S. consider moving towards decriminalization of drug use? Thank you.
I'll let Ambassador Brownfield go first and then give the final word to the Secretary General.
I bet the Secretary General won't touch that question, by God. I will, but you probably you'll find my answer initially flippant, but I'll offer a little bit of substance behind it, and at least give a bit of substance to it. Will we consider that? We certainly will consider it if one national legislature and 50 state legislatures choose to consider and change the laws that are currently on the books in the United States of America. What do I see as the likelihood of that? My view is worth no more than that of anyone else in this room in terms of assessing and analyzing what will happen in the U.S. political system in the course of the coming years. My own personal hope would be they would take into account the principles I laid out, in which I thought and still believe there's basic consensus, if not complete consensus, and some of the ideas I laid out in terms of how we could consider adjustments and modifications to current law, rules, regulation, and strategy. But I would remind everyone here that I am the Assistant Secretary of State for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. Inside the United States of America, my voice counts absolutely no more than that of any of the others of you who are U.S. citizens. If you're not a U.S. citizen, I'm afraid you don't have quite the same voice in this U.S. political process, but in your own country's political process, you would have that voice. Coletta, you have pointed out, and correctly, I think this is part of what I believe a serious debate should include. You have pointed out the experiences of other countries, and a number of countries have experimented with adjustments and modifications to their policies. And I would say I think that is valid. I think we should look at them. I don't think we should draw kind of 100% conclusions, because none of these experiments have been, if I could say it, a 100% success in terms of what their supporters wanted, nor a 100% failure in terms of what their opponents suggested would happen. I have also, as I looked at places like the Netherlands, like Portugal, like Switzerland, more recently places like Uruguay, I believe the distinguished ambassador to the Republic of Colombia would note that his Supreme Court has recently made a determination in terms of decriminalization of certain types of possession or consumption. In Colombia, there are lots of places where experimenting is going on. I actually think that's a pretty good thing. I kind of like the concept of having a number of experiments where we're able to learn from fairly small test cases what is working well, what is working less well, what is not working. I've also noticed that a number of the countries that have been experimenting with this have made adjustments over time. The Netherlands has probably been at this longer than most any other country I can think of right now. And as you know, they have adjusted. They've fine-tuned. They've permitted some things, not other things. They allowed the coffee houses to do a lot initially, and then they've ratcheted back and had certain additional controls placed in them. I mean, they're learning. We should be learning from what they are doing. One could make an argument, I do not, because I do not have a right to a voice in terms of domestic matters, but one could make an argument that if 2 states in the United States of America are going to proceed with a legalization regime, the other 48 states and 1 District of Columbia should be watching pretty closely. What happens? What is the result? What is the impact? Do other people come in? Does stuff go out? Do the people that actually live there like it, dislike it? Do we find that they're making adjustments as this process goes along? That's why we have experiments. That's why I suppose I could make a case for those of us who at least come from a federal system. That's kind of the fun thing about a federal system, is you could have many different regimes, approaches, and systems inside a larger national system and kind of learn by what happens. I'm not saying yes or no. I'm not saying I support or oppose. I do have views, but on this matter, domestic U.S. policy, my views don't count more than for those of anyone else in this room, and much less than those of Jose Miguel Insulza.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, you have the final word.
Actually, I would first subscribe completely to what Bill just said. I think that all those matters should never be done every place at the same time. I think it's maybe one would have preferred that it wasn't 2 states, it was 10 states or no states. But once it happened, the best thing to do is see what happens and to make conclusions out of that. And I should say that that's an experience that's valid, that's very important, as the ones that you have already mentioned, and that are still going on. In my country, for example, we were faced with quite a situation around well, I came here 8 years ago. This must have been about 12 years ago. 11, 12
I remember
years ago.
then.
Right. You were there.
He had much more hair back then.
No, that's not true. That is not true.
I'm a diplomat, Secretary General.
And actually, we had a problem with that. We had very high penalties for drug use, and actually in Chile, the private consumption of drugs is not penalized; it's decriminalized. So we discovered that many of the use of the small traffickers, when they were brought before the judge, they were young people who were trading 2 or 3 pieces of cocaine, and so the judge preferred to declare them users and punish them with very low penalties. There were very low penalties at that time. So we decided first to make it official that private consumption is not penalized, it's decriminalized. Why not public? Because somebody said, the difference between the wealthier parts of society and the poor is that the first one take their drugs at home, and the others were to go out on the street. Because we discovered, and you mentioned this, that in the in the poorer areas of town, in the polls we had, everybody was consistent when they asked what do you most fear when you go out on the streets. They would say the drug traffickers dealing their drugs in the corners, and we felt that therefore we couldn't just say decriminalize any kind of consumption. We decriminalize the private consumption. You can, I mean, nobody's going to go into your house to find out if you are having you are taking drugs. And at the same time, we made a scale of penalties for small traffickers and large traffickers, trying to put the burden of the punishment in those people that were really dealing in a large number of drugs. That seems to have worked. It seems to have worked until about a month ago, when a gentleman, a very important, it seems, I had never heard of him, but it seems that he's very important in the song and dance. I mean, in the television and varieties, he was found with about 600 grams of marijuana. So the big question started: is it big? Is it a big number? Can he be called a user? He was going to give it to some friends, or he was going to sell it, etc. Well, the gentleman is still in jail while people discuss about it, and probably that will make a new push for some new rules in this matter. The big problem with marijuana is that there are so many places already in which everybody knows that it's very easy to use. I mean, as some state, which was not mentioned, it is not part of the first two, but it's, I won't mention the name, but it's a large state on the west of the country, in which you get, I mean, everybody who goes there says that to get marijuana, you only have to fill some kind of a form in a place where some doctor, which you will never see, will give you a prescription, and you go home with half a pound of marijuana, which is like a big bundle. So actually, the problem is that it's at this point. But let me tell you, I do prefer at this point that we keep following those experiences, seeing what happens to them.
Yeah.
Do they like it? Don't they like it? Is everybody does crime decline? Does it not decline? And not try to push something for the whole of society for which society is not prepared. Because if we push any of the extreme formulas, as Bill mentioned, we're going to get a lot of people against it. We're not going to have the minimum of consensus to apply them right. So let's go on in the matters of legalization and decriminalization. I would say let's go on with the experience that we have and see what happens on the road, and to take more decisions.
Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking our distinguished panelists. Thank you both very much.
The Minister of Health of Chile, when the report appeared, said we should decriminalize the use of drugs.